There are new bombshell claims today from royal insiders who say King Charles's cancer is incurable and he will likely die with the disease.
Just minutes before an urgent announcement from Windsor Castle had plunged the entire nation into silence. Prince William and Princess Anne entered the White Room with faces more tense than ever before. No smiles, no pleasantries. And most importantly, King Charles was absent. William stood before the podium, his hands clasped tightly at his sides, and confirmed what the royal family had tried to avoid. King Charles had suffered a serious heart attack following a private meeting at Windsor. The king had lost consciousness in critical moments, required emergency treatment, and was now unable to continue his public duties or constitutional obligations. But the moment that silenced the room came, when William paused, looked down, and said two words, "My father." It was no longer the voice of an heir reporting on the king's condition. It was the voice of a son trying to remain calm in the face of the possibility of losing his father. Anne stood beside him, holding a handkerchief but not raising it. Her silence and stern demeanor seemed to confirm that Charles's condition was even more serious than what the palace had just announced. And immediately after the announcement ended, a senior secretary entered carrying a red briefcase containing urgent government documents. But this time, the box wasn't delivered to King Charles's room. It was placed before Prince William. Was this the first sign that the de facto power of the monarchy had begun to shift? Before delving into what really happened behind closed doors at Windsor, if you're new to the channel, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the latest royal stories. 3 weeks before Prince William and Princess Anne's national appearance, the real crisis began in a closed room at Windsor Castle. That day, King Charles was in St. George's Hall, rehearsing for an important investiture ceremony. Everything initially proceeded according to protocol. The aides stood in their positions. The documents were ready. The king tried to maintain his usual composure before those present. But midway through the rehearsal, Charles's right hand suddenly gripped the back of his chair. His face turned pale almost instantly. Princess Anne called her brother's name, but Charles did not respond. 1 second. 3 seconds. Then nearly 11 seconds passed in a terrifying silence. To those in the room, that brief period seemed to stretch on endlessly. Anne was the first to rush forward. She took Charles's arm and immediately realized this was no ordinary fatigue. The king was having trouble breathing. His body was unsteady. His answers were rambling, and one hand was clutched to his chest, as if he were trying to hide pain. Anne immediately demanded that the entire rehearsal be stopped and medical assistance called. But Charles objected. He didn't want an ambulance in Windsor Castle. He didn't want a royal ceremony canceled without explanation. And above all, he didn't want the press, the government, or the public to see a king losing control in the middle of his duties. For Charles, even a delay of just one afternoon could raise dangerous questions. But Anne wouldn't accept that hesitation. She told her brother straight up that he had only 2 options: either agree to be examined by a doctor immediately, or she would cancel the entire event herself. This time, Charles couldn't argue any further. The royal physician was summoned and delivered a clear warning. The king needed immediate rest, an urgent cardiovascular checkup, a significantly reduced workload, and avoidance of meetings that could add to his stress. Charles nodded. He signed a shortened schedule. Within hours, everyone believed the king had finally accepted the seriousness of the situation. But just days later, meetings began to reappear. The breaks disappeared. Medical checkups were postponed. Some doctors' appointments were even canceled and replaced with official duties. In the following weeks, Charles's condition did not improve. After long meetings, he frequently experienced shortness of breath. After a private dinner, an aide saw him leaning against the hallway wall due to dizziness. At times, Charles experienced chest pain, yet insisted that everyone continue with the schedule as if nothing were wrong. Each time he was advised to rest, he gave the same reason the monarchy could not be suspended, simply because the king felt weak. Camilla knew of at least one of these incidents. She had advised Charles to reduce his workload and listen to his doctor. But when he asked her to keep it a secret, Camilla eventually agreed. Perhaps she believed she was protecting her husband. Perhaps she feared that the truth would trigger a succession crisis. But that silence allowed the dangerous situation to remain hidden. Anne, however, did not see things that way. In a private argument, she told Charles that his courage had turned into recklessness. Charles replied that a king could not suspend the monarchy simply because he himself was weak. Anne looked directly at her brother and warned him that he was no longer gambling with his own health. He was forcing the whole family to watch a disaster that could have been avoided. Charles didn't reply. He turned away but continued with his work schedule. 3 weeks after that warning, Anne's worst fears finally came true, right here at Windsor. After a private meeting at Windsor Castle, King Charles suddenly stopped in the hallway. There was no cry for help, no clear warning. In seconds, his body lost its balance, and he collapsed to the horror of his aides standing nearby. Medical teams were immediately called. Charles was unresponsive. His heartbeat became erratic, his breathing weakened, and all doors leading to the king's private quarters were quickly sealed. In those critical moments, no one saw a monarch at the head of the monarchy. On the emergency bed lay an elderly man, unconscious, and completely dependent on the doctors trying to keep him alive. Medical experts had to intervene urgently to stabilize Charles's condition. Unsigned government documents were left on the table. Government meetings were halted. The ceremonies which had been prepared for months were immediately postponed. For the first time, the royal schedule depended not on the king's decisions, but on whether his heart would continue to function properly. As Charles slowly regained consciousness, a doctor bent down and asked if he knew where he was. The king struggled to open his eyes. He didn't ask about the pending files. He didn't ask which meetings had been canceled. He didn't ask if the press knew. And he didn't ask if the ceremonies could continue. Charles's first question was so quiet that the doctor had to lean closer to hear it. Have William and Anne been informed? In that moment of power, ceremony and title became meaningless. Charles only wanted to know if his son and sister were nearby. The news quickly reached William. Before his aides, he maintained his composure. He read every update, inquired about his father's condition, and demanded that the palace refrain from making any inaccurate statements. But as the door to his private chambers closed, that composure began to crumble. William unbuttoned his cufflinks, but his hands trembled so much that the small button fell onto the table. He stood still, staring at it for a few seconds, as if finally realizing that this crisis was no longer a situation the heir could resolve with ceremony and reports. William had been prepared almost his entire life to be king. He understood the Constitution. He understood audiences. He understood the responsibilities of the successor. But no one had ever taught him how to assume power while his father lay behind a closed door fighting for his life. William understood that every decision from this point onward could be interpreted in two completely opposite ways. If he acted too slowly, the royal apparatus could descend into chaos. Government reports would be delayed, diplomatic engagements could be stalled, and the public would begin to doubt whether the monarchy was still functioning. But if William moved too quickly, he might be seen as exploiting his father's illness to seize center stage. That was the fear that almost made it difficult for him to breathe. Not the fear of becoming king, but the fear of being seen as a son rushing to replace his father. In another room, Anne stood by the window and recalled every sign she had witnessed. 11 seconds of silence in St. George's Hall. The times Charles had to pause to catch his breath. The pale face after meetings. The promises of rest that were quickly broken. Anne had always been the strongest in the family, but this time she couldn't stop the guilt from creeping in. She wondered if she should have been more assertive. Should she have canceled Charles's schedule despite his objections? Should she have told William sooner? Anne had tried to protect her brother from his own stubbornness. But now she didn't know if she had done enough. Camilla reacted in a completely different way. She sat alone before a cup of cold tea. No one asked her to speak. No one asked her what she should announce. Doctors came and went from Charles's room, but the important conversations gradually shifted to William and Anne. As Camilla approached the door of the medical room, a doctor politely asked her to wait outside. The door closed right in front of her. That moment not only frightened Camilla of losing her husband, it also made her realize her position was changing. For years, she had been the person closest to Charles, the one who heard his private complaints, the one who understood the weariness the king never let the public see. But when the real crisis struck, the ones brought into the decision-making circle were William and Anne. Camilla was no longer the main voice, no longer the first to be asked, and perhaps no longer the one who could control the narrative about Charles. Meanwhile, Catherine found William standing alone before a family photograph. In the photograph, Charles was sitting next to Prince George, both looking in the same direction and smiling. William gazed at the picture for a long time before confessing that he didn't know what to say to his children. How could he tell George, Charlotte, and Louis that their grandfather might not be the same again? How could he tell George that Charles's illness might bring him far closer to the throne than the family had ever hoped? Catherine approached, placed her hand on his, and reminded him that honesty couldn't be reserved for the public. It had to begin within this family. William didn't respond immediately, but he knew Catherine was right. That evening, when the palace had fallen silent, a senior secretary brought William a medical record marked top secret. William opened the first page. After only a few lines, the pain on his face turned into astonishment, then into anger. Because what's on the record suggests this crisis was never really a surprise. As night fell over Windsor Castle, most of the corridors were silent. Only the light from Prince William's temporary office shone. On his desk lay a red file stamped Top Secret. William took a deep breath and opened the first page. From the very first lines, he understood that this crisis hadn't begun that afternoon. It had been quietly brewing for weeks. He continued to turn the pages. The file contained a complete medical report he had never seen before. The incident at St. George's Hall 3 weeks prior was fully documented. The moment Charles lost his responsiveness, the results of the cardiovascular examination, the recommendation for absolute rest, the assessment of the risk of recurrence. Everything was there. Only one thing was missing. William. He had never been informed. William immediately pulled Charles's schedule aside to compare it. The more he looked, the more his expression changed. The cardiology checkups had disappeared from the schedule. Days the doctor had recommended rest were now filled with meetings. Some medical appointments had been replaced by formal audiences. Even Charles's dizziness, chest pain, and interruptions to his schedule were no longer included in the general reports William received each week. He turned to the last page. A small note caught his eye. "Do not forward this report to Prince William." William jumped to his feet. He immediately requested to see Charles's private secretary. The secretary entered looking tense. William set the file down on the table. His voice was calm. "Who authorized all these changes?" The room fell silent. After a few seconds, the secretary bowed and replied with only 2 words. "The king." No explanation, no justification. Those 2 words were enough to shatter all of William's doubts. He no longer saw this as an unexpected accident. His father knew. The doctors knew. Some close staff members knew. Only his family remained outside the door of truth. William took the entire file and walked straight to the treatment room. Seeing her grandson's expression, Anne understood that the worst had finally been discovered. Without asking any further questions, she silently followed. As they entered the patient's room, Anne gently closed the door behind them. Only 3 people remained in the room. Charles was still tired from his treatment, but upon seeing the file in William's hand, he immediately understood what had happened. William placed the file at the foot of the bed. He looked directly at his father. His voice remained calm. "Why do you think we don't have the right to know the truth?" Charles didn't answer the question. He looked at the file and asked in return, who took the confidential medical records out of the clinic. At the Tsidiksfakar, William could hardly believe what he had just heard. Even now, Charles's primary concern was how the records had left their storage location. Charles tried to maintain a calm tone. He said everything was under control. The doctors were doing their job properly. There was no need to create further panic. William shook his head. He took another step toward the hospital bed. Do you know what I received today? I received government reports. I received diplomatic documents. I received documents requiring approval. I'm supposed to keep this whole machine running. How can I protect the monarchy if even the truth about the person at its center is hidden from me? For the first time since Charles's hospitalization, William didn't speak with the usual calm. His pain began to turn into anger. He looked at his father and spoke slowly. You always thought that family love was a weakness to be controlled. You thought that by hiding everything we wouldn't suffer. But what you really did was leave us on the sidelines until things were almost beyond repair. Charles closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he spoke very slowly. An heir cannot carry all the private fears of a king. William immediately retorted. I'm not here as an heir. I'm standing before my father. I just don't want to one day learn the whole truth when it's too late. The atmosphere in the room became heavy. This time, Anne didn't stand in the middle to mediate the argument. She stepped forward. Her eyes never left Charles. Do you remember St. George's Hall? You promised to rest. You promised to listen to the doctor. You promised me. But then you continued as if nothing had happened. Anne paused for a few seconds. Her voice lowered. The most painful thing isn't that you're sick. The most painful thing is that you forced all of us to join in your denial. You made us watch you disappear right before our eyes. Those words silenced Charles completely. After a long time, he finally spoke softly. What my father feared most was not illness. He looked toward William. Father feared that if his son did all this well, the country would realize the monarchy could still function without him. For the first time since the beginning of the crisis, Charles didn't speak of responsibility. He spoke of fear. William opened the last page of the medical report. He read slowly line by line. If the patient returned to his previous workload, the risk of another serious cardiovascular event was very high. William closed the file. He asked no further questions, for Charles's silence answered it all. His father had known the risk for weeks, and yet he chose to continue. As the conversation ended, the Windsor sky outside began to turn the gray of dawn. Elsewhere in the palace, red briefcases were being prepared to be carried out of the king's private chambers. For the first time in years, their destination will no longer be King Charles. Before the sun rose over Windsor Castle, a quiet but historic change began. The red briefcases that had been delivered to King Charles's private chambers every morning were now diverted. There was no abdication, no throne transfer ceremony. No bells or official announcements rang out in the palace. Charles remained king, but from that moment on, the de facto machinery of the monarchy no longer revolved around him as it once did. The red boxes were placed before Prince William. Inside were security reports, diplomatic files, government documents, and urgent matters requiring attention to prevent a power vacuum. William looked at each neatly arranged stack of documents on his desk. He understood that these were more than just papers. Each box represented a part of the responsibility his father had once held. Senior advisors began reporting directly to William. He was tasked with receiving important government meetings, national security briefings, urgent diplomatic matters, royal audiences and representations, decisions that needed to be made to keep the government running smoothly. When an aide approached and pulled the chair usually reserved for King Charles away from the table, William immediately raised his hand to stop him. He looked at the chair for a few seconds and then stated clearly that no one should act as if their father had vanished. William did not sit in Charles's place. He chose the chair next to him. It was a small gesture, but everyone present understood its significance. William had accepted the responsibility, but he did not want his new power to become a symbol of the removal of his father. He didn't want the palace to see an heir usurping the king's place. He wanted them to see a son keeping that position from being vacant. While William began handling urgent paperwork, Princess Anne took over the rest of the palace. She didn't waste time on lengthy consolation speeches. Anne began by demanding a complete overhaul of the schedule. Trips that could put further pressure on Charles were canceled. Non-essential tasks were postponed. Staff were reassigned. The number of people allowed in and out of the treatment area was strictly limited. Any communication concerning the king's condition had to be confirmed before being sent outside. Anne understood that a crisis like this not only created anxiety, it also provided an opportunity for factions within the palace to vie for influence. Some wanted to be close to William. Some tried to protect Camilla's position. Others worried that if Charles didn't return, the entire old order would change. Anne decided not to let anyone use her brother's illness to build their own power. She controlled the schedule, controlled the meetings, controlled even the information allowed to leave Windsor. But that firmness quickly angered Camilla. When Camilla entered the meeting room, William was conferring with senior advisors, while Anne stood at the end of the table with a new calendar in her hand. Camilla didn't sit down. She immediately asked why a series of Charles's assignments had been changed without her consent. Anne replied that the changes were made for the king's health and the stability of the monarchy. Camilla looked straight at her. She said that she was Charles's wife. She understood what he needed better than anyone in the room. Anne didn't lower her voice. She replied that if that understanding had truly been enough to protect Charles, today's crisis probably wouldn't have happened. The room fell silent. William didn't interject. He understood this wasn't just a scheduling argument. Camilla was seeing her access being curtailed. For years, she had been the closest person to Charles. But now the most important decisions were being made by William and Anne. Camilla tried to remain calm. She said that Charles wouldn't want to be treated as someone incapable of making decisions. Anne countered that no one was taking away his authority. But when someone is struggling to keep their heart rate stable, self-respect cannot be prioritized over medical advice. The argument only ended when Charles's private secretary entered. He carried a transcript of instructions that had been previously approved by the king. Everyone in the room fell silent as Charles's weak but clear voice rang out. He appointed William to manage all external royal duties during his treatment. Anne was tasked with overseeing the internal affairs of the family and the palace. William and Anne would jointly be responsible for communicating information about the king's health. Camilla's name was not mentioned in the media instructions. When the transcript ended, Camilla said nothing. She simply looked at the tape recorder and then turned to William. In that moment, she understood that Charles had not chosen her as his primary voice, not because he no longer loved her. But in this crisis, he believed William and Anne could create the stable image the monarchy needed. After Camilla left the room, Anne opened a black leather box. Inside was a small key. She placed it in William's palm. It was the key used to open the urgent state document boxes. William looked at it, but didn't immediately take it. Anne closed her grandson's fingers around the key and said, "I'm not replacing him. I'm just holding that position for him." William nodded. But before he could reply, the meeting room door suddenly burst open. An aide entered, his face pale. Charles had just suffered a second heart attack, and this time, the doctors were no longer sure that the changes in the palace were only temporary. King Charles's second heart attack was brief, but it dashed hopes that it was merely a temporary setback. After stabilizing the king's condition, the medical team reached a clear conclusion. Charles could need months to recover and could not return to his previous workload without facing a more serious risk. Immediately, the entire royal schedule changed. Charles's name disappeared from appointments. Royal cars waiting in Windsor were ordered to disperse. State visits were postponed, the investiture was rescheduled, and important receptions were reassigned to other members of the royal family. Prince Edward and Sophie were given additional duties. Security around Charles's treatment area was also tightened, with a strict list of those allowed in and out. Camilla insisted on remaining in the hospital room, asserting that she was Charles's wife, not a guest who could be asked to leave. Anne led her out into the hallway and stated frankly that love could not override medical orders. At Kensington Palace, William read his father's health update twice. After a moment of silence, he looked at Catherine and said, "This is no longer temporary." That evening, William and Catherine gathered George, Charlotte, and Louis. They explained that their grandfather's heart was very weak, and he might need a long rest. George asked the most difficult question. "Does that mean father is about to become king?" William paused. He looked at his son and replied, "It means that first and foremost he needs us to be a family." Charlotte offered to paint a picture of Charles. Louis asked if their grandfather could hear his voice on the phone. George remained silent for a longer time, as if he had begun to understand the burden that was approaching the family. Later, a private recording of Charles was discovered. In it, he thanked Anne for protecting him from his own stubbornness. He reminded William that leadership begins when fear no longer controls duty. Finally, he apologized to Camilla for ignoring her advice to rest. Camilla listened to the recording alone. When Charles's voice began to apologize, she stopped, covered her face, and burst into tears. In that moment, she was no longer the queen worried about losing influence. She was simply a wife afraid of losing her husband. Hours later, Charles sent a handwritten note. He wanted to meet William and Anne alone. No advisor, no secretary, and no witnesses. Only 3 members of the family remained. For the first time since the crisis began, Charles didn't start with a directive or a work plan. He looked at William and softly said that for years he had believed it was a king's duty never to let anyone see his fear. He had spent his life concealing his fatigue pain and even signs of illness, fearing they would undermine the image of the crown. But now Charles admitted he was wrong. That silence nearly cost him everything. He said that even if he recovered, he wouldn't have the strength to return to his old schedule. The constant traveling had to end. Most public duties would be transferred to William, and Anne would continue to support him to ensure a smooth transition. Charles also affirmed that from now on, his health would no longer be concealed, merely to protect his image. He turned to Anne and thanked her for always speaking the words he didn't want to hear. He hoped Anne would continue to be by William's side, for her honesty was what the family needed most in this new phase. Anne smiled sadly. She replied that before being a royal princess, she was still Charles's sister, and that was a responsibility she would never relinquish. When Charles began to speak as if his reign was coming to an end, William immediately interrupted. He said he would take on all necessary responsibilities, but would not turn a medical crisis into a farewell while his father was still alive. Charles looked at his son for a long time and confessed that what he feared most wasn't illness. What he feared was seeing William run things too well, and then wondering if the country still needed him. William stepped closer and gently replied, "Being needed and being loved are not the same thing." The words silenced the room. Charles slowly extended his hand toward his son. Anne gently took her brother's arm. William grasped both their hands. No ceremony took place. No oath was taken. But in that moment, a new agreement was formed. Charles would no longer conceal his illness. William would shoulder responsibility without seeking power. Anne would keep the family united so that this transition would not become a divisive one. Outside the room, the entire nation awaited the answer. For the most difficult task was no longer convincing the family, but convincing the nation that this transition was not the end of King Charles. By afternoon, hundreds of people began gathering outside Windsor Castle. They carried flowers, letters, and signs of support. A message placed near the gate moved many. "You have served us, now let them take care of you." The palace later confirmed Charles remained king, but his workload would be permanently reduced. William took on most public and constitutional duties, while Anne and other senior members kept the royal apparatus stable. There was no decision to abdicate. When Camilla appeared with William and Anne, she told Charles that the country was with him. Her voice choked, and William gently escorted her back inside. From his hospital room, Charles watched the crowd on a screen. When the national anthem played, he asked for the volume to be turned up and quietly shed tears. That evening, the king's recorded speech was broadcast. Charles thanked the medical team, the public, and his family. He admitted he had held on to the burden for too long. He said the crown is strongest when responsibility is shared, the truth is spoken, and love is allowed to help. In the final scene, Charles walks slowly to the window with support. William stands nearby, Anne watches from the door, and Camilla waits quietly by the chair. Charles raises his hand to greet the people. The crisis did not end his reign. It only ended the belief that he had to suffer alone. If you enjoy dramatic royal stories, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos. Thank you for watching.